Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Adventures Through the Mind. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. This is a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how can we work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, not just other humans, but the world at large, and not just now, but in the past and onwards into the future. So that's the guiding inquiry of the show, and we explore a number of topics. Today, we're going to be exploring the topic of the kinship worldviews, also known as the Indigenous Worldview, and also how that worldview, the kinship or the Indigenous worldview, contrasts with the world we live in now. Our guest for this episode is Darcia Narvaez, who has been on the show several times now, which is great because I just love her work. And for the first time, 4 Arrows. I'm going to read their bios now. Wahinkpe Topa, 4 Arrows, is a maid relative of the Oglala Lakota and a sun dancer pipe carrier with the medicine horse Teospaye. A recipient of awards and recognitions for his activism in behalf of Indigenous people, he is also the author of many books, articles, papers, and presentations on Indigenous worldview. Former Dean of Education at Oglala Lakota College, he is currently a professor in the School of Leadership Studies at Fielding Graduate University. Darcia Narvaez is a professor emerita of psychology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, USA. She is a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the American Education Research Association, and the American Association for the Advancements of Science. She studies moral development and human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, integrating anthropology, neuroscience, clinical, developmental, and educational sciences. She has published hundreds of papers and over 20 books, including the multi-award-winning book Neurobiology and the Development of Human Morality, Evolution, Culture, and Wisdom. She serves as president of kindredworld.org and hosts the webpage evolvednest.org. Together, these two individuals are authors of the recent book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Indigenous Voices introduce 28 precepts for rebalancing life on planet Earth, which features selected speeches from Indigenous leaders around the world, necessary wisdom for our times, nourishment for our collective, and a path away from extinction towards a sustainable, interconnected future. So the book presents these 28 precepts, and each chapter features an excerpt of a speech from an Indigenous person. And then both 4 Arrows and Darcia kind of have a literary conversation about what precept is being represented in this particular excerpt, and then sort of how it applies to the larger sort of framework that they're exploring with respect to the two different worldviews, the dominant worldview and the kinship worldview. And so in this interview, we're going to explore some of those precepts, specifically precepts such as courage and fearless trust in the universe, non-anthropocentrism, ceremony as life-sustaining, the centrality of gratitude, and an emphasis on heart wisdom. Additionally, we also explore the basis of what a worldview is and why our guests propose that there are only 2, the Indigenous kinship worldview and the dominant Western worldview. We go in depth on the historical rise and impact of the dominant worldview and the intergenerational cycle of trauma it propagates. We look at the left brain, right brain dynamic and how it aligns with worldview, perception, and behavior. We explore how generations of anthropocentrism impacts our capacity to perceive our interconnection with nature and each other. We do a substantial dive into death, dying, grief, and ceremony. And we also explore at the end what it means to be and become fully human. So it was truly a pleasure to host both of these individuals on the show. Again, Darcia for the first time. She's had 2 individual episodes and was recently on the Why Connection Matters Psychedelic Cafe, and 4 Hours for the first time. So did I just say that? Anyways, it was very exciting to have both of them. And I really hope you enjoy this interview. One specific point is, if you're listening to this, you might hear a difference in the sound quality from older episodes, and that's because I got a new microphone. You might see it in the video as well. Unfortunately, my technology was not set up properly when I first used this microphone, which is when I interviewed these two. So my audio has this weird crackling sometimes, which I did really well to get rid of, but you have to bear with me. Thankfully, our guest audio is fine, and they're the ones that have the most to offer. So just hopefully that's not too disturbing for you. And the other thing that I'd like to say is a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon, especially the names of people listed on the screen here on YouTube or in the description to this episode, wherever you're checking it out. Those people have been giving significantly, some of which for a long time. So their names are listed on the credits, including the names of individuals who have made generous one-time PayPal donations. And generally, a big thank you to everyone who is my patron, because without that financial support, I wouldn't be able to continue investing time and money into this show. And in a sense, it's like it gives me the opportunity to do the thing that I most deeply care about in this world, and to do it on this relationship of sort of generosity and acknowledgement, because I'm not asking anyone to give me money to enjoy my content. I'm asking, if you're enjoying it, please do help financially support me in producing it. It's voluntary, it's relational, and it's really a beautiful way to be living my life. So I thank you very, very much for supporting the show in that way. If you are not yet a patron and you are enjoying the show, please do consider becoming a patron, even as little as a cup of coffee once a month, a few dollars. Everything is something, and it all adds up to go a long way. So I would really appreciate that. You could also leave one-time PayPal donations or other forms of donations, such as crypto, or buy something from the online shop. So all of those options are in the description to this episode, or you can head to jameswjesso.com/support, and that would be much appreciated. So without any further ado, here is my interview with Darcia Narvaez and Four Arrows, episode 166, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. Enjoy. Okay, cool. That was fun.
Hey, and that is a powerful sounding microphone with these earphones on.
I could give you the proximity effect.
Holy smokes.
Well, it cost me an arm and a leg. So, well, not literally, because I have both of them. Not my arm and a leg, if you know what I'm saying.
We're good. You couldn't see your legs.
Okay, great. So what I have in mind for today, it's funny too, because one of the precepts is like humor as essential. Did I write that one down? And this whole setup process was just like so fun and playful. So maybe that's like already I'm in the process of being in the living expression of one of the precepts as we speak, which is nice.
Yeah, instead of getting annoyed and irritated and swearing, you just let's have fun with it. Whatever's going on.
Yeah. So what I was, I mean, maybe we're in the interview now. But what I was hoping for is to sort of start off with, because part of what the book is two people with, harmonious but different perspectives, or sort of different bases of their perspective, speaking about central issues, these multiple precepts of the kinship worldview. And so what I thought would be interesting would be for each of you to sort of be like, this is where I'm coming from. So this is where I'm coming from. This is what is informing my perspective. Then I want to ask you about, what a worldview is and why you sort of present that there's only two. And then I'd like to go in and just ask you about some of the precepts. Does that feel good for you too?
Uh-huh. Sounds great.
Okay, so why don't we just start off there? And also feel free to respond to each other, to ask each other questions, clarifying questions, to sort of be in dynamic with each other, like you're in dynamic in the book, and not to worry about just strictly answering my question step by step or whatever. But yeah, why don't you each present, where it is that you're coming from into this book?
After you, Four Arrows.
Well, okay, I was going to say ladies first, but I'll go first. I was interested only in indigenous ideas or American Indian ideas as a child because my mother used to tell stories about her background, but usually they were negative. After the Marine Corps, I sort of had a chip on my shoulder after Vietnam, and I went and did whitewater adventures to kind of take it off. In a near-death experience I had on an uncharted river in Mexico, I was saved by the Raramuri Cimarron people, a group of indigenous people that have not really had much access to Western culture. I was amazed at everything that I experienced during the few weeks I was there, and they saved my life. And I began to have this interest in how indigenous people operate. So I quit my profession, went back, got a second doctorate with Indigenous Worldview Cognate, and the fates had it that I would be Dean of Education as soon as I graduated at Oglala Lakota College. There I got confirmation of what I experienced with the Raramuri, with small groups of people that had gone through all the challenges of colonized life and had returned to their traditional values. I became a sun dancer with them. And I realized that there was a way of understanding the world that was very, very different than I had grown up in the dominant culture. So I began studying worldview more than I did even when I was at the university, by going to cultures that were still fairly untouched by civilization. And the confirmations came. And that just became a realization that our fundamental understanding of the world and the precepts that scholarship has put forth, that we've put into, there's actually 40 of them, and we use 28 in our book, are the kinds of virtues, the kinds of moral beliefs that have allowed us to live for 99% of human history in relative harmony. And this contrast I learned was from my time with the indigenous people, was not a rigid either or hierarchy. This is right, this is wrong, because that is part of the dominant worldview that we have. Whereas the indigenous worldview is a non-dualistic, seeing complementarity and continuum. So it's all about dialogue. It's about how we're all in the same boat and it's sinking. And how can we look at these precepts? Most people who will agree with the indigenous ones, at least 2/3 of them, in their heart, but will know that that isn't how they're living their lives. And so that's where I came from.
Well, my story is a complicated one, but I could say just that I came to the indigenous worldview through science. I spent a lot of my adult life wandering and seeking and different careers, a lot of interests. Half my childhood was outside the United States. And so I grew up as a third culture kid, bilingual, bicultural, always kind of not fitting in a way, the dominant culture. So I've been trying to find where that golden thread of truth is in the world. And it's a little thread with a lot of other stuff around it that's not so true. And what happened maybe 2 decades ago now, I was reading widely because I was in the area of moral development. My PhD was in mostly reasoning and cognition about morality, and realized, that's when I was reading widely, wait a minute, attachment is a neurobiological thing, and the way you're treated in early life engraves your brain and your mindsets and your orientations to life. And and then finding the anthropological work showing that there are these standard practices for raising children all over the world and nomadic foraging communities. They seem to matter because these adults there are so calm and generous and cooperative. And so I was putting all those pieces together, and I had a book proposal and started writing a book about the neurobiology of human morality. And the book had a mind of its own, and it wasn't what I promised the publisher. In the end, it brought me to the indigenous wisdom. That's what we have to get back to if we're actually going to be fully human. So my work now has been in the early experience effects on brain, body development, and morality, well-being, and such. And the indigenous perspective and ways of being are really key to having us live a flourishing life and foster flourishing in the rest of the planet, the rest of the living beings on the earth.
And Darcia, I remember one of the things when we first met that really got us working together as a team was you had mentioned baseline, the concept of baseline. Can you tell a little bit about how that's got started?
Yeah, baselines, the idea of shifted baselines comes from oceanography or marine biology, where Pauly noticed that the scientists assumed that the state of the oceans when they were children was just the normal way the ocean should be. And then they were missing over generations the decrease in marine life, the increase in plastic, and there was this experiment they did in the 50s where they took a boat from California to Hawaii, and every little bit while they put a bucket over the side and would pull it up. And in the 1950s, they pulled up lots of fish. They replicated this in the early 2000s. And when they pulled the bucket out, it was full of plastic. And so you have to see across generations over, a longer time span. And for us, a deep history. We have to go past the last 2,000 or 5,000 or 6,000 or 10,000 years. We've been around for millions of years, 2 million years, depending on how you count it, 6 million years for the genus. And so if you look at that big, long time span, you realize we're really weird now. We have moved into traumatizing ways of being. And so people have forgotten or aren't paying attention to the baseline. So the baseline for raising children, the baseline for what a human acts like. It's not normal for humanity to be selfish and aggressive. It may be momentarily, but not as a matter of disposition, which we see all over the place, and so on.
Yeah, it's like the parts per million in climate change and all of these different things. There's baselines. Even I'm guilty of it. I created the first no-take marine park zone here in Mexico on the Costa Alegre. And we had to hire a marine biologist from the University of Guadalajara to do a baseline study of how many fish there were so that in 2 years we could prove our success. And well, I understand the logic of it, and and it's important and was necessary, but to go back to what they are now compared to what they were 100 years ago is just it's not what's going to allow us to survive.
So a question that's coming up for me is not actually on my trajectory. So I'm wondering, how it's going to be received, which is, I want to ask you about, what is a worldview? Why do you define that there's only two? You're speaking about the dominant worldview, the indigenous worldview. But something I'm wondering about is, Darcia, I know your language is like 95% of human history. We were in this particular sort of way of this particular cycle, this particular way of being, and then that shifted in the last 10,000 years or so. And one of the things I've been thinking about recently, and in specific respect to indigeneity and the indigenous worldview, is the impact that the sort of like widespread Roman and then Christian conquest had on the displacement of the indigenous peoples of Europe and etc., and how that later, as as a response to trauma, became the sort of displacement, colonialization, and sort of like borderline genocide of people in the New World as well. And I'm wondering if either of you sort of track or have tracked the impact of that that worldview emerging from history, moving across and disrupting indigeneity across the old world as well as into the New World, or if that lands at all for you.
Well, it's almost so obvious that I have to just say, yes, of course. The colonization phenomenon, let's just talk about the Americas, and began essentially with Columbus. And if we look at statistics on populations of individuals throughout the Americas, and what happened 15 years just afterwards, we know that the decimation through disease that came over on the boats from lack of sanitary conditions in London and all that stuff, and of course the brutal genocide, that's continuing. We can look at the politics of indigenous treatment in the United States and all over, and we see that this culture side now, which is a form of genocide, is continuing. So there's no question that whatever happened 10,000 years ago, where people decided that materialism might be more important than spirituality. Maybe the stuff that we learned. Look what we've got here. We got the surplus of food, and we can be pretty powerful. And because all of these problematics, these potential problematics, have always been in humans. And that's why indigenous cultures used nature as a model for interconnectedness and symbiosis, and created cultures. But somewhere along the line, obviously, and we know it's happened several times throughout history in indigenous places, there was this diversion into a separation from nature, an anthropocentric, human-centered separation. To maintain that, and to conquer the world for materialism, which is the colonization, they had to get rid of that worldview. And we know that even in our origin stories, most twin hero stories that Joseph Campbell talks about always have a solar and lunar twin working together. If we look at the origin stories of Romulus and Remus, Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Hercules and Iphicles, on and on, we see that the solar twin dominates, either kills the lunar twin or subjugates it to not being known about. So it's so important that you brought the idea of colonization up, because our settler colonialism, which we're all part of, is continuing the dominant worldview. And until we can get together on that and not look at this as an us versus them, and understand the continuum, when should we be hierarchical? When should we not be? Why are we doing seeing Earth as a unloving it? I could go through all the precepts, and that's the job before us: is to decolonize, to counter hegemonic ideas that are continuing the dominant worldview. And we can get into worldview when you're ready.
And I would add, thank you for errors. I would add some little more bits. I think humans kind of almost accidentally moved into the direction we're in now, domesticate a few animals and then maybe a few more. And then, we've got to have people monitoring the herd, and tend to be males, men and their brothers. And so patriarchy starts to come into play. And agriculture, well, we threw these seeds over here, and look, we've got too many people now. We need more of this food, and the weather is changing, the climate is changing. And so it seems like a good idea. And look, I'm going to, Marvin Bram, the historian, talks about how there's probably a few guys in Tigris Euphrates area that decided, well, we could take advantage of the Nile, or the riverbed being so rich in soil, and here you guys do the work. And they somehow coerced people to be the laborers, but then they were in charge. So all this, somehow we got into this hierarchical orientation that included patriarchy, and that then undermined early child raising. So breastfeeding went down. Our species requires 4 to 6 years of breastfeeding for optimal brain and body development. And that's lots of touch and responsive care, and then also play. But when you get into an agricultural system or these systems of hierarchy, you're forcing everyone into roles, and they're not able to be themselves and grow and become their uniqueness. Each of us has gifts, that can be honed and grown for the community. And so there's just a whole bunch of traumatizing events that have occurred that are just ingrained now. We all have inherited trauma, and we just think it's normal to, get scared easily or to be anxious. We can inherit those capacities. So it's a long-standing place we are that we've created over time. And I think just by inch initially, and now it's just overwhelming us, the system that we've allowed to coexist with life on the planet.
And you had mentioned the religious aspect of it. Robert Warrior writes about the incompatibility between indigenous spiritual ideas, which are not an organized religion in any sense, but he compares them with, for example, Christianity, and he believes they're incompatible. I've not gone that far. I believe that they are compatible, and it's a longer story. We have a person in our that we selected in our book who is a Christian, and I think he represents that potential. However, the fundamental beliefs of the Abrahamic religions essentially were all about maintaining this, what we now call the dominant worldview, or what was the Western worldview, and that begins again with origin stories and the concept of sin and the diminished value of other than humans. So that plays a big role and still does today with the history of missionaries and et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is really tying into sort of the basis of my initial comment there is having been reading about, and I mean, to the extent to which I can intelligently and accurately sort of reiterate, something that is not a deep learning for me, or like a deep investment of research for me, is something to the extent of how the sort of movement of, I think it's like the Celtics had taken over a bunch of Europe, but they like kept the cultural dispositions of the peoples there relatively okay. Like there was some loss, like you had to sort of like accord to some degree, but you could still be yourselves. And then Rome managed to, under Caesar, conquer or defeat the Celtics. And when they started roaming through, they were like, no, you're Romans now. In fact, like you have two choices. We either obliterate and kill everybody here, or you become soldiers of the Roman army. You become Romans and we protect you, but all your, the men and whatever, you have to go fight and do this to others. So there's this huge displacement of people, and what was once an indigenous place-based cultural identity becomes sort of this weird, distorted, trauma-informed state-based identity. And then as the state started to collapse, Christianity started to come in and said, oh, don't worry, there's still spiritual union and connection here, but it's not actually here because this place is not what's real. What's real is the true home, which is somewhere else. And you get to that by serving the values, virtues, and agendas of an off-planet God. And the way that you do that is to ensure that his love, mercy, and care is adopted by everybody by whatever means necessary, even if you have to kill them to liberate them. And that trauma sort of then spreads. And the suggestion in the book that I've been reading recently is that the trauma that was embedded in the people as a consequence of the push of this sort of religious paradigm and the state paradigm and everything that went with it made it so that when the people from the old world, from the Europeans, left and went over to the Americas, they weren't able to see that what they were doing to the people of the Americas was the very same thing that had been done to them, whatever, like 1,000, 2,000 years earlier, and all of which in support of this sort of like weird identity, worldview, and religious understanding that itself was sort of like both forced and a sort of a traumatic compensation for a traumatic event that displaced them from their original spiritual religious identities, which was place-based and land-based, etc. So thinking then colonialism and the acts of colonialism, even on behalf of the colonizers, is a consequence of those very people having been colonized, displaced, and etc. And it goes back to, probably before Rome in some sense as well, but this sort of like push of the Roman Empire, that sort of conquering and the impacts it had when Christianity started weaving in. And I don't know how actually accurate or exhaustive what I just said is, but that was sort of what I was bringing to the table.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of wisdom in the idea that you are what you experience throughout your life, especially early childhood, but multi-generational, there's no question. Epigenetics is showing us that the idea of nurture versus nature has really been answered. And so certainly if you come into a country and you've never had any experience of authentic democracy, everything has been kings and queens, then that's the kind of setup that you're going to do, right? So I think it's a matter of forgetting. And Michael Fisher talks about this work as a decolonizing hypnosis technology. He calls it a technology. We have to get into that. And worldviews were part of the scenario that you described. They were part of that game. The early worldview in the academy in the late 1700s was really sort of a debate that tried to stop dialogue between the Christian religion and other religions and science. And it was, that even today has kind of returned. If you put in worldview right now in Amazon, there'll be thousands and thousands of books that will come up. And I would say 99% of them are a religion claiming to be a worldview to try to get back, because science has obviously won that debate. We're going with Robert Redfield's idea of worldview, which is that essentially, he believed, and he's considered by many to be the father of social anthropology, and led a team at the University of Chicago in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And he initially believed there were three worldviews, and worldview being defined, as more and more scholars today are, as very, very deep. Generally, scholarship will say an ideology is a worldview, a religion is a worldview, a philosophy, everything is a worldview, which really waters down the original concept, even of Kant, who was the one who kind of coined the word. And that is, we're talking about the deep relationship between humans and nature, and humans and the mystical or supernature or the what comes after. That's the fundamental thing. And those precepts about empathy or competition or truth stem from that. And Redfield thought there were three of them at first. There was the Eastern, and those traditions that brought forth yoga and the Eastern ideas. There was the Western, and then there was what he called the primitive. But by the late 30s and probably the late 40s, he had wrote that the East, although they still have their unique spiritual traditions and yoga, generally speaking, their societies are adopting the Western motif. So he says, now there's only two. And the primitive one, what metropolitan and primitive, we use indigenous and dominant, that the greatest tragedy in human history was the overtaking of the indigenous understanding of how to live on the planet. And so that idea of two worldviews is what we have put forward and what we're trying to get into the hearts and minds, which means that all of the great religions and great cultures and great diversity of everything generally have in common things on the left side of our chart versus things on the right side of our chart.
Yeah, let me just add a few things. Thanks, Four Arrows. So Redfield talked about the two worldviews as one perceiving the cosmos as unified, sacred, and moral, and the other viewing it as fragmented, disenchanted, and amoral. And you know where we've been is in that latter view, propelled by science. Not all scientists, but the kind of dominant science. Not even Darwin. Darwin was more oriented to the unified, sacred, and moral cosmos, but that's not how people understand his work now. So I think what happened also, just to add to, when the Europeans came to the Americas, they were bringing that dominant worldview, and they could not perceive the paradise that was here. You know, you could smell the blossoms for miles off the coastline. The birds were in the millions and billions, right? And trees. The United States was largely forested with old trees that were, manicured. The forests were manicured, so it made it easy for the British Army to march across through the forest, because the native peoples were, burning the small brush and such. So anyway, the blindness of the Europeans. Frederick Turner has written about this, and Kirkpatrick Sale. They have talked about that inability to see in that Western kind of dominant adversarial orientation to nature. And now we have all these climate change, weather issues, in part because of deforestation, because of ruining the coastlines in various ways, so that the weather comes across and does much more devastation than it would if we hadn't done all that engineering.
Well, it's interesting that they had to pass laws when the first colonists came over to make it illegal to go and live with the indigenous people. Many people went AWOL, essentially, because they saw that there was more hygiene, things were cleaner, people were happier, food was better,
More freedom.
Yeah, more freedom, and so the laws were actually passed to make that illegal to do that, because so many people were doing that. That not a very large number, of course, but enough that inner DNA was being recognized.
Yeah, the refugees, they were refugees from Europe because of all the enclosures. There are like 5,000 enclosure laws passed between 1100 and 1600, or I think actually 1900. So they were just kicking people off the common lands, and then they were homeless and they were starving. And so that led to this push to leave. And so we end up with a lot of refugees in the Americas from Europe, even then. So a lot of trauma, lots of trauma.
And that's actually what the question I was having there was, like, lots of trauma, because Darcia, your work speaks to how when the sort of like neurobiological relational needs of the child are not met as a consequence generally of the parent having not had their needs met, and thus being raised by and then growing into expressing a kind of culture that doesn't meet their own needs nor the needs of their child, that the traumatized child psychologically, neurobiologically has a tendency towards hierarchical tendencies, either seeking dominance or submission as some sort of reaction. And I'm just like wondering about that. Like, these are traumatized people. They're unable to see the sort of, I think there was like, it wasn't not non-hierarchical sort of nature of the indigenous way, if I'm remembering this correctly from your book. And instead they just saw likely that they needed to dominate, because the fact that the indigenous people weren't dominating means that they would be submissive, and so they would need to dominate or something. And I'm wondering if you feel like that fits with your model of understanding.
Yeah. So when we can see that when you're nested, when your needs are provided for in early life, you're going to develop a much more flexible intelligence and easy way of living, because you feel at home on the earth. You have so many social skills, micro social skills of getting along with others because you spent so much time doing that, being carried around by all sorts of people as a baby and playing with different people and having freedom to explore your local place, your landscape. Whereas a child that's left alone, to sleep alone, trained to not speak up when they have their needs, because that's what they learn. If you leave them to cry and sleep train them as a baby, they learn to shut down and they don't grow as well. And they're going to be less flexible. If they only have one caregiver or even just two, they're not learning a whole bunch of different ways to be in relationship. And so they're going to be much more rigid and scripted to get through life. So sleep training, a lot of developmental psychologists recommend that you do things consistently for a baby. Why is that? Well, we know from rat studies that if you let them be able to predict when the shock is going to come to the cage, they do better than if it's random shocks, right? So when you leave babies alone to sleep, if you do it consistently in the same way, that's better than if you're kind of random. But again, it's not optimal, right? You are stressing that child and you're going to misdevelop the brain in some fashion. Something's not going to develop that our ancestors would have developed in a nested environment.
And so Darcia is, talking about the bottom up of this, which we all know that, everything we need to know we learn in kindergarten, and that early childhood is key to developing our beliefs and our personalities. And Darcia says our partnership is sort of a bottom up and top down one, because how to produce parents who are already messed up and traumatized is obviously an important part of this. And Bruce Lipton's book Biology of Belief gives an example, and it's not a coincidence that Bruce spends every year with me and White Standing Buffalo at a Cree Sundance, because he understands the importance of ceremony as a trance-based medium for learning. And so this idea of epigenetics, this idea of self-hypnosis, if you will, that, like I say, ceremony essentially is a form of that. These traumas, which can be mitigated, and it can happen from the top down, and so that we can make it not occur in the first place from the bottom up.
Right. So top down, meaning that we can help adults heal and dehypnotize from the dominant worldview and reclaim, restore the kinship worldview. And the bottom up is the how the brain and body are constructed. That just happens without our willfulness, without our choice about it as children, right? Happens to us. So this is all intergenerational responsibility to make sure that we are caring for children so that they optimize their capacities rather than getting caught in the trauma-inducing pathway and continuing that.
One of the things, so I'm going to try to formulate it. Something I think I understand, but I could be incorrect. So please let me know. Is the discussion of the indigenous worldview holding, and you might have to unpack this for the listeners, a non-anthropocentrism. The humans they're not on top, and a sort of recognition of non-human entities as being sort of like entities of their own right. They're not subservient to us. They're like the trees, the rivers, the et cetera. These are beings, or maybe persons in some sense. And I'm wondering about what your thoughts are, and if it has, whether or not it's even the case, that sort of, many, many generations of living in dynamics where the natural world is seen in that way influences a person's sense of self and how they believe in the world. Because as it stands, we are essentially who we are as a consequence of who we are in relationship with from the very beginning and throughout our lives. And presently in the dominant worldview, the only beings that we are in relationship with are other humans, and they're generally other traumatized humans, either on that sort of large societal level or very specifically down to specific events that would traumatize. And I'm wondering how much of a role the recognition of nature and the sort of the personhood of non-human entities influences that sort of the things that you describe as precepts in the Indigenous worldview.
My hypothesis is that it's key, it's foundational. If you grow up believing that dirt is bad, that trees can just be cut down without thought, that a cockroach is something to step on, that sets a mindset that allows you to look at fellow human beings who are different, who are smaller or a different color or have some disability. I believe that this concept of diversity and its importance, the concept of inclusion, all of the things that we are trying to do in schools with regards to respect for others, the hiring of chief diversity officers in colleges, all of these things, I feel that they are falling flat because they continue the human-centered or anthropocentric perspective. Until we can truly recognize that this interconnectedness with sentience and egalitarianism and what that means in the cycles of life, I don't think that we really have a chance.
Just think of how many hours children are forced to stay inside a building. So what? How many? 12 years of schooling, of thousands and thousands of hours spent away from the natural world. A lot of people are concerned about that now. Forced kindergartens are trying to remedy that so that the students, the young children, are spending their days outside exploring and just being in touch with dirt and mud, which is very antibiotic and very healing in various ways. So what we've done over the last millennia is we've gotten used to being inside our own walls. And then you start to think, oh, we're separate from nature. That's not us. It's dirty and all that. And, we're superior. We don't have to go do what they do, those dirty animals. We're more controlled. And then you get that's the most dangerous thing, superiority. And various sand talk. The author, Wahinkpe Topa, is it? He's a native from Australia. He talks about that as being the key problem, is when you start to think that you're superior to anything, then you're going to do damage, right? You are now on that's the dominant way of thinking, right? Always think, where am I in the hierarchy? So I think our need for allowing children to explore the natural world, but not just a grassy lawn. It has to be a forest and an ocean side, a river side, the complexities of the natural world, and giving them the freedom to do that. Jean Liedloff pointed this out long ago in her book, The Continuum Concept, which she contrasted the upbringing of the Yaquanas in the Amazon with her experience in North America, and couldn't believe it, how happy they are and how developed they are. And so in the Indigenous worldview, all the stuff we're talking about, and that is giving the child the freedom to be. And that's something where we have to work with adults who are so now anxious and afraid to let children have that freedom.
I thought it was interesting. I wrote a book called Amerindian Rebirthing. It was done from some scholars out of the University of British Columbia. And they talked about reincarnation stories that they solicited from a number of tribes around British Columbia. And it's just interesting to bring up that, we all who think of the concept of reincarnation coming from the East, and I have a dear friend who's a Buddhist and who speaks the language and spent time with the Dalai Lama, who says, well, there's still a hierarchy in terms of, although there's respect, there's still the hierarchy that humans are above. You don't get reincarnated as an animal usually as a good thing. Whereas the scholars, about 40% of reincarnations were cedar trees and salmon and bear and insects and things like that. I think it creates a philosophy of life's interconnectedness that once you recognize it, and there are scholarly books that come up like The Secret Life of Trees that when anybody reads them, they go, oh my gosh, they communicate with their relatives and warn them of insects. But indigenous cultures knew this from observation and respected and learned from it. It wasn't even just another equal sentient being. It was a teacher, whatever that part of nature was.
Yeah, I talk about receptive intelligence. We forgot that this ability to hear and perceive the communications of entities around us. When Four Arrows and I have done exercises with our students to try to stimulate this kind of intelligence. But I think it's also important to realize that there's less of a concern about death when you have this feeling that the whole universe is unified, it's moral, it's sacred, and you are part of it, and you're going to be transformed. When you die, you're going to transform into something else, and maybe it'll be a cedar tree, right? Or, and maybe you have choices in that transition period to not be so scared. And our Western dominant culture is very left brain dominated, which is this ego consciousness, very afraid of death. Oh no, not me. The ego always wants to be up there and in charge and number one. And so there's this obsessiveness, fearfulness and grasping, right? Because of that domination by that part of our capacities.
And I think of our chart as a left and right brain in a way, Darcia. I think that, and that's where the complementarity potential is in having them work together in some way.
I think was it in your book that you mentioned Ian McGilchrist and what's it called, the master and his
emissary.
Yeah, it just before I had read your book, I had been reading another book actually about DMT entities, but that's an aside. And there was a discussion about this sort of like the damage that happens when the sort of the emissary takes the lead. Like the left, I think that I'm getting this right, like the left brain sort of ego structure takes the lead, and that actually it's the right brain sort of intuitive interconnectedness that sort of offers the lead, and it's the left brain that sort of navigates that and applies it appropriately. And when those flip around, then, we end up, I don't know what the sort of ultimate consequence is other than maybe the last 10,000 years of history.
That's what he would say. Yeah.
That's one of our precepts, is leading with the heart and following with the head, which is just the opposite. So you're right on target with that as important. And this brings up the word spirit, spirituality, which from an indigenous perspective, I define as recognizing the sacred interconnectedness of all. But the idea of spirit as being something that is a soul, or that like the Ramari think there's 7 souls, but there's all different unique versions of it. But the idea that we are spirit inhabiting a body is an important aspect of a worldview that understands the interconnectedness of all, and understands and appreciates and accepts the mysteriousness. We have our gods in the dominant worldview, named and identified, and they've written things. In all the indigenous cultures that I've studied, and I've studied hundreds of them, the word for what the dominant worldview refers to as God always translates to usually a verb, great mysteriousing. And so what Darcia is saying about accepting death and being fearless of death is part of accepting the great mysterious thing and the beauty that surrounds us in the world that could only possibly can continue.
I think, but back to McGilchrist's idea, it's the integrated brain, right, that we want. So is more right hemisphere dominated, but also has that left brain, logical, sequential thinking for solving problems, good when you need to solve a problem. But most religions around the world, major religions, say it's very dangerous to stick around in intellect, in that thinking mind, because you start to think that's all you are. That's that ego consciousness, right?
Well, I had a...
Yeah, it's the integratedness we need. Just one more thing.
Yeah.
And then what has happened in the Western world in the last millennia is we've undermined the right hemisphere's development, because that happens mostly in the early years. And so if you're not nesting the children in all the ways that we talk about, soothing birth, breastfeeding for several years, self-directed free play, welcoming social environment, multiple adult responsive caregivers, nature immersion and connection, and routine healing practices that should be part of your life from the beginning to the end. If you don't have that right hemisphere supported in early life, you're going to end up then using that left brain more, because that's what schooling's all about, is training that effortfully learning, and that conscious stuff you can put on a test and answer. And then they miss out on the heart, the intuition, the right hemisphere's development. And so you flip between that survival systems of safety you're born with, the self-protection, the stress response, you brace against others when you feel threatened, and you move between that and this intellect, right? You're missing the big piece, which is that heart and the heart connectedness. We connect with our heart, not so much with the head. I mean, that helps, but that's not enough.
I usually don't take the science position. That's Darcia's role. But that brings to mind that I had a doctoral student who did a study with MRI machines and her uncle, neuroscientist, whereby when people were at a place of peacefulness, neither the right hemisphere nor the left hemisphere was lighting up. All the pituitary glands and all the things that were lighting up when there were other things that they were looking at in the MRI machine on a video. And when they were in total peacefulness, the right and left hemispheres were blacked out. But the corpus callosum that connected the two was just lit up like the Golden Gate Bridge. And so I think that is exactly what Darcia is talking about, is the integration. And whereas this kind of makes you think, well, that integration is by doing this early and emphasizing the heart first and the right hemisphere primarily, that what then happens is it's not things that don't just happen here and just happen here. The integration starts to show up with the peacefulness, or what we call wolo kokichiapi, in the inside of it. And I think that's good. I still have criticism though of neurophilosophy. Greg Kaheti and this professor that had the MRI machines for my student, we wrote a book called Critical Neurophilosophy and Indigenous Wisdom, because what we found halfway through the book was our doctoral students were showing us that many neuropsychologists are so left-brained and so enamored by the dominant worldview that the lens through which they interpret data has led them afoul. And we talk about that with the Institute of Noetic Sciences in an article that you can find.
I have like a couple of different ideas, and I know they're all relevant, and I'm wondering if I ask about them, if you can tie them together for me. And it's about the precepts around courage and fearless trust in the universe, which you were just speaking to, as well as the understanding, embracing death and dying, which you were also speaking to, and then also a precept about ceremony as life sustaining. And multiple times you've talked about, the importance of ceremony, ritual healing practices, not only just as a basis, but also explicitly as a potential intervention for the traumatic expression of almost humanity that is coming from, so many of us because of the worldview that we're being raised in. Wondering if you can kind of weave those things together for us.
Well, I think Darcia has some cool things to say about the being unafraid of death. Darcia, you want to talk about that? And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we do in our practice here with ceremony.
I can say...
Wait, can we take a pause? There seems to be a very angry animal or frustrated animal in somebody's environment.
Or
oh, yes, that's those are. Now can I put mine on pause?
You can put yours on mute. What are they? They're oh, you're on mute now. Okay, cool. And then we'll let you know when it's time to come back. Darcia, go ahead.
Yeah, they are giant birds that look like Beep Beep the Roadrunner. They're about this big, and whenever they see a snake or something on my tree out here, they go crazy, warning everybody.
Like the blue jays in our yard, or the crows.
It makes me think of what you had. I want to go back to what I asked, but just trusting this sort of like the non-human participants here, their intervention is thinking about the receptive intelligence, and then something I had heard about many years ago but never really followed up on, which was like bird language, and like being able to listen to the way the birds are responding in a forest as a way of getting cues of what's happening around you, and the sort of like and receptive intelligence being involved in the ability to read that. And so having the birds come in and this explanation here, much appreciated.
Yeah, John.
Well, we take it to heart. Like if I was going to walk outside with my Chihuahua and other my little granddaughter or something, simply because of what just happened, I would ask them to be looking around carefully for a snake, for example, right? So I really take it to heart that they've come to that. They were in that tree all morning, and it's the first time they made any noise.
Yeah, so it makes me think of sort of like in the city, and I'm very guilty of this, being like, oh, shut up, I'm trying to sleep, like, oh my God, like, please. And like, but the difference between that to being like, oh, thank you so much, fellow resident of this land, for ensuring my safety and letting us all know that there's danger present. But then again, I'd also get kind of frustrated with my neighbors if they were just like having a party at like 6 a.m. when I was trying to sleep, but that's an aside.
One of the things that I do in ceremony is we will either after the lodge or during the lodge. I'm referring to the Inipi ceremony. People refer to them as sweat lodges, and we do several a week. And we will walk out silently with the instruction to, when you get to the ocean, keep moving forward with the expectation, imagination that this is the moment of your death, heart attack, crocodile, whatever it is. And allow yourself, with what we've been talking about in the lodge, to trust in the beauty of that moment you die. And when you fall into the water, do that and just stay there for a few minutes and do it. So it's practicing dying. It's practicing this idea of death. And it's had remarkable impacts over the many years that I've done this. And of course, I had an NDE myself, a near-death experience. That has given me, of course, a lot of confidence in being able to teach people who come to my lodge.
And you recommend creating a death song?
And well, I mean, I don't recommend that for them. I refer to it and say, that would be something that you might want to do. Many tribes and do that, have a death song. But you can, it can be a million different things. It could be a prayer, it could be a poem, it could be just a thought, right? And so I say, but that can be sort of a hypnotic trigger, because willful determination is very, very, very difficult to have effectiveness without imagination. Einstein says imagination is more important than knowledge, and it is. If I put you on a 2x4 on the ground and ask you to walk across it, no problem. I raise it 1,000 feet in the air and bring you up in the helicopter and ask you to do it. You say, no way. But if I give you $1 million and you say, well, for $1 million, I'll try it, you'll probably fall, because the imagined possibility of falling would be greater than the reality, right? So this idea of imagination, intention, while in a lower brainwave frequency, is what ceremony is built around. And having triggers like a death song can help bring you to that place. Gandhi had a small prayer. And when he was shot, he used it right away. So that was sort of his death song.
You talk about courage and fearlessness, 4 arrows, so that, yeah.
So the simplest way I can frame it is a story I tell about. We have a place in British Columbia on the river where everybody that goes there, I offer, come on up and climb and jump into the waterfall. And it's about 30 feet up, but most of us, that we get up there and we think about jumping into this waterfall, which we've checked out for floating logs already and everything, is a scary thing. And our people are afraid of heights. It's scary. But if you get someone say, look, I'm going to do it a couple of times. You can see it's fine. My grandson's 9 years old. He's going to do it. You're going to love it. Now they get up there. And that means they got courage. They've developed courage, which we all think is great. And now with that courage, they climb up the rocks. They stand over the waterfall and the deep pool that it's splashing into. They got courage. And if they just have courage and don't move into fearlessness, they jump and they go, on the way down. And on the way down, they're still having to have courage. As they hit the water, they realize they're okay. They swim to shore and they go, holy cow. Now, I say, I want you to do this again, but this time, I want you to move from courage to fearlessness. Well, what does that mean? Well, to be brief, we're talking about, I want you just to trust the universe. You made the decision to jump. There's nothing you can do after you jump except keep the fear and the courage dynamic operating, or trust the universe. And so now they go up. And if they are able to do this, and many are, they'll have that courage and that anxiety, and they'll get up and they're still going, even me. And then once their feet leave the ledge, they trust the universe. Now, a very different thing happens. They see an eagle flying overhead. They feel the velocity and the feeling of the air coming up at them. They might see a salmon going underneath, past them just before they hit. They feel the plunge of the water from the toes to the top of the head in a dynamic way. It's beautiful. And this essentially is what I've learned from the Kumkak and the Wawamuri and the Kogi and pockets of Lakota sun dancers. This is what I've learned how they live. Their humor is alive. Their sense of beauty is alive, no matter how traumatic the situation.
Because they trust the universe, right? The universe takes care of us. And to get into that mode of being, I think, is the real enlightenment.
Yeah, there's this story reminds me of, if you pardon me, a brief anecdote of the first and only time I went bungee jumping, which was 50 meters, which is not very far horizontally, but vertically is quite a distance. And there was a lot of courage to get there, to get strapped up, to like get raised on the platform and be up there. And when you bungee jump, at least as a beginner first timer, it was like, you don't jump, you just fall forward and you stand on the ledge and you just fall forward. And I stood on the ledge and the courage got me to the ledge. And there was just like felt like a million reasons why this was a bad idea, all happening at once until it just bottlenecked. And then there was just emptiness and peacefulness and just like a trust. And I just fell forward and just loved my entire descent. And then the bouncing and all the rest. And
so you did it.
Yeah.
You did it.
And I often, like, especially in times in my life where there's been a number of moments in my life where it's the sort of like, I jumped, in the face of like fear, and I just like trusted and I jumped literally into water or bungee jumping, skydiving even. And like recognizing that as sort of an example of being like my capacity to trust, to step forward into something that
I would
otherwise
imagine,
is terrifying.
James, I would imagine that if you looked at all 40 of the precepts, you would find a whole number of the indigenous worldview precepts that you really embrace. That would be my guess, that because remember, these are everybody who is indigenous to Earth. These are not belonging to a tribe in Africa or the United States. These belong to all of us, and some people have more than others. And my guess is that you would find that not only that peacefulness that came to you when you jumped allowed you to move from courage to fearlessness, from fear to courage to fearlessness, but I would guess that we could go down this list and there would be other ones that you tend to move towards in your life.
Well, thank you for saying so. It feels like an honorable mention or something. I feel there's a very positive sort of sense of being seen and held in positive regard by you. Therefore, thank you. So how do we layer that in now with the like, it feels very intuitive. Like I'm like, oh yeah, of course. But maybe explicitly, like, how does that and ceremony, this sort of courage and fearless trust in the universe and ceremony, how does that relate into the embracing of and understanding of death and dying in the Indigenous worldview?
Well, it does, because it's a continuation of the beauty of recognizing the interconnectedness and the beauty in the world. And it's as simple as that. Once you have all of these moral precepts, which, like Darcia, that's why she got into that. That's what these are. These are all moral precepts, right? And once you have that idea that time is cyclical, that generosity is the highest expression of courage, that personal vitality is the laws of nature are prime. Once you have that, automatically there's no separation between the cycles of life and the cycles of death. And you see it when you recognize interconnectedness with a non-human, because you see some of the cycles are 24 hours. A fruit fly, I think, lives for 24 hours. And so it's automatic. It's just an automatic phenomenon. Now, that doesn't mean it happens automatically. I had a vision to implement the cat-fawn connection, which is taking just 4 of the worldview precepts, the ideas about courage and fearlessness. Cat-fawn is fear, and so ideas about indigeneity and courage and fearlessness, authority and ideas from the worldview about authority, the ideas about words and honesty, and ideas about nature. So by just taking fawn, FAWN, fear, authority, words, and nature, and looking at a problem you have in your life, or a challenge or a goal, and saying, how am I in the dominant worldview on this? How can I complement it with the indigenous worldview, or move toward the indigenous worldview? And when you do that cognitively, and asking where it came from, what was the source of it? Usually early childhood or some kind of a traumatic hypnosis. And once you have these 4 things identified and associated with the problem, now you want to do an in vivo exposure. You want to go out and prove that you've changed, you've transformed. But it won't work most likely unless you use CAT. And CAT is concentration activated transformation. It's using the phenomenon of self-hypnosis to imagine the specific thing you're going to do to now live according to this fearlessness, or take authority yourself for the decision or whatever you're going to be doing, or speak more honestly to yourself about what the problem is, and learn from nature. So cat fawn, that's just a very brief thing on a very long process, but it's available for people to use as a sort of metacognitive, reflective, worldview investigating way for actual transformation, and it works quite well.
So with staying on the topic of death and dying, I think it's perhaps this is okay. So let me sort of draw together a scenario here. It's like, I feel like it would be, and I don't know how incorrect I am, it would be easy to be like, oh yeah, so then the fearlessness and the trust in the universe means like, it's like, pardon the slang, but like, yeah, dying is all vibes. It's good. We're all chill. Like, he died. It's good. But actually it's not so. My assumption is that it's actually not so emotionally detached. And I'm wondering if you could speak to grief and grief in the community or in the person, the dying person, because of course, like even I would assume, like even its trust in the universe, unless it's been like a long time, there's still going to be like, oh yeah, and I love my life, so I'm sad and I'm grieving that I have to say goodbye to that life and to everyone I've ever known all at once, right? So I'm wondering, like fearlessness, courage, etc., trust, but then how does that layer into the experience of grief individually and collectively?
Which is a very important part of the death process in all indigenous cultures. The grieving and the loss is a very important part of it. Darcia, do you want to talk a little bit about it from a psychology perspective?
Well, in terms of indigenous practices, John Young, who wrote the Coyote Guide to Nature Connection, he talks about how the San Bushmen, who represent our ancestral genetics, they've been around for 150,000 to 200,000 years, and our genes come from them, in part at least. And he asked them about what they do, how often they have a ceremony, like a grieving ceremony. And they said, oh, sometimes every day, depending on what's happening. And that means trance dancing and drumming and singing and letting yourself go into the comunitas, the group feeling of being one and being one with the universe, and then letting go and letting go and letting go, right? So we need to express our emotions in some fashion. If we don't do it, obviously it goes into our body, right? And expresses itself in disease. So they are doing this routinely, and that's why we call it one of the evolved nest components, so that people realize they have to do this all the time and cleanse themselves. And the Western wisdom traditions, which were intended to help the individual be receptive to divine energy, also is about letting go of ego, letting go of fear, and cleansing your mirror, your receptor to those energies. And that the Western wisdom traditions start with adults, and I start with babies, right? So if you let the child, try not to interfere with distressing them, the baby in particular, and no coercion or punishment and all that, then they will learn to do this. But we need community to help us with these practices. You can do them alone, but it's just, it's nicer, better to do it with other people or with the natural world around you.
Well, beautifully said. I remember Larry Brentrow did experiments where he had, I don't think you can do this anymore, but young infants with their parents they would try to scare them. And they were dry. They were with their mom. They were happy, and they would put on masks and they would jump out behind something and scream. And they did all these kinds of things to try to scare the child, and none of them worked. The child would just kind of like, maybe go back and look, or kind of look around and look up at mom, and they had all kinds of reactions, but none of them really started to cry. Then he played a cassette tape of another child crying, really crying. And when the child heard that and looked over at the tape, started crying. So I think the emotion that Darcia is talking about and cleansing the mirror, it doesn't mean that emotion is not strong, that love of life, and that we are here in community. The three of us right now, it's just not a coincidence. There's an interaction, and to value that interaction is part of the process of our soul's journey, and the loss of the life with the family and the community is a great emotional phenomenon. But because of what Darcia said and how we practice and understand it, we move on.
So it's that ego again that wants to grasp and hang on, right? And it's the right hemisphere that's aware of universal connection and universal existence. So you have to get into that mode and support that mode. And then it's easier to let go, right? And people who have unresolved relational issues or usually disconnection, I think one of the big things about the Indigenous worldview is it's focused in on connection, everything connected, to be aware of that. But a lot of people feel disconnected, and then the ego is like, I'm all by myself, right? And that gets so scary. So I think if we have people who are in the last days or months of their life, to try to help them get back to a sense of connection to the universe, especially, but also to the natural world around, to other people, and to their greater spirit, the great mystery, the mysteriousness, and to relax into that.
Yep. After all, it's the kinship worldview that we're talking about.
Yeah.
So I have two things I want to talk about, and like one of which directly leads into the like it has a sequence, and I'm like, this could really close out the interview nicely. But I might be risking the trajectory by by stepping back on something here. But especially, this has been running through my mind the entire time because it's on my mind. It's the nature of the podcast in many ways to speak about the topic I'm about to mention. But also it feels very relevant both to the discussion of ceremony as well as to the discussion of, Darcia, what you just said about like returning to like like being in a deep sense of connection, especially in our sort of dying time for people who spent their entire lives growing up in the dominant, ego-oriented, like disconnected worldview, is the presence of specifically psychedelic plants and other substances, which are very prolific across a lot of indigenous cultures and history, that their presence in ceremony, and specifically right now, medically, scientifically, the use of psilocybin derived from psilocybe and other species of mushroom to help resolve or clear that sort of the existential distress that they call it, like a total existential distress. And in many ways as a consequence of people having experiences where now they feel deeply, like deep in their very core of what it is to be alive, that they are connected to something much grander, to their life, to the people around them, to something beyond. And I'm wondering if either of you can speak to that. Darcia, I've asked you this question previously in the show. You didn't really at the time have much sort of evidence base to speak from in your research. So maybe for others, you could take this one. But what are your thoughts on the presence of psychoactive plants and fungi in ceremony generally, but also in respect to dying time?
I think it's an important question, and I've had a lot of experience with it. Just two things that come to mind, for example, to get to the answer as quickly as I can, is let's take ayahuasca, for example. We know that there's two plants that are required to be put together. One that allows for the hallucinogenic journey into your DNA. The other that allows the body to cause it to happen in the brain. The ideas of how somebody thought about having to connect those two, there's no way on earth it could have been done with experimentation. There's no way on earth that any scientist in the Amazon, the plants talked to people. When I was with the Raumuri Simiron people, I had the honor of being the first outsider to attend a peyote ceremony. And when I was sitting on the logs with 9 other men, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the shaman, Augusto Ramos, had a red cowboy handkerchief with a big peyote bulb in it, and he would walk up to someone and blow through it, and immediately that person would get off the log and be in a trance and be moving around. And so I was last, and I'm thinking to myself, well, they're just play acting. I was disappointed in a way because I had never done a ceremony. I was kind of disappointed, and at the same time, I'm going, wow. So what do I do? Do I play act, or do I sit there and go, well, no, wait a minute. I'm not going to do that if nothing happens. And So then the person next to me, he came over, and I saw more clearly out of the corner of my eye. I was trying to be respectful, and he went and blew into it. And this guy goes, and I thought, I guess I don't want to get in trouble here. It took me 2 weeks to earn his trust. I'll get up and do this also. Well, I didn't have to fake it. Now, how did that happen? What I'm getting at is, until we understand that this is a spirit that we are dealing with, whatever it is, yeah, there's certain pharmaceutical effects that can happen when it's taken and put into a laboratory and given to somebody, but it isn't going to get the job done. Without the worldview, I have a doctoral student who did a doctorate on, and he's led over 170 ayahuasca ceremonies, and his research question was, do you become counter-hegemonic as a result of an ayahuasca ceremony? And what he found was a relatively few, I don't remember what it was, like 18% only. And those are the people that had a lot of preparation they did, and worldview preparation, spiritual preparation, and did reflection and afterwards, right? It's bigger than just the pharmaceutical properties of this medicine spirit, and I think that's a really important thing to get across, and also that it wasn't done with the frequency. Now ayahuasca plants are at risk. I have one of my friends from Peru has stopped doing it because indigenous leaders are enticed by the money. All over the world, this is happening. We're losing. Indigenous people are finally are breaking down and losing it. But traditionally, the use of these hallucinogenics was done ceremonial, in ceremony, and not with the kind of I'm having a bad relationship with somebody, I'm going to go take ayahuasca. So those are just some things I want to throw out for you to start with, James.
Darcia, do you have any comments there?
No, I love Foero's storytelling about his experiences. So helpful, I think, to give us an idea of how things work in the real world and not just in the ivory tower.
Oh, yeah. I will say one other thing real briefly that came to mind. I have a dear friend who is a yogi master. And over the years, he has done lodges with me for a long time. And I took him to ayahuasca ceremony. And on the way back, this is what he told me. And this is, just what he said, one person's experience. He said, 4 arrows. He said, all of the images that I saw, from the feathered serpent to such and such, I have seen in my meditations without, having taken this mother of all medicines, plant medicines. He said they weren't in the dynamic 3-dimension and with the intensity of color, but I have seen all of those in my meditation. I just wanted to throw that in. It came to my mind.
Cool. The recognition of there being a spirit there. And of course, in the academic sort of intellectual field of study, it's like, especially coming out of Tim Leary and Richard Alpert turned Baba Ram Dass's, their work in the 60s, was the big thing was like, setting and dose, like those make a big difference to the kind of experience you have. It's not like a definite thing. You take this and it's this effect. It's like, no, these factors significantly contribute to the experience. And mindset truly is a lot more than what am I taking it for? It's very much everything that we show up with. 4 hours, what you're speaking to, this whole sort of worldview with which we engage. And I personally feel that, even just the extracted molecule, is something that we only know how to produce because it was derived from the intelligence of an entity that exists on this planet, which are the fungi, and that when we consume it, we have the opportunity to interact with the spirit of that thing, which has a kind of intelligence, and in some sense, I would say perhaps maybe a kind of agenda it's wanting to serve, which I think is in the service of life, as fungi generally, if you zoom out and really consider it, they act always in the service of life. So not necessarily what's most comfortable for the individual or what is safest, but what is safest for the individual being, approached by the fungi, or colonized by the fungi. Cultivated? Colonized is a bit of a weird word to use. But that spirit, it's easy not to see. It's extremely easy to obfuscate its presence with a mindset that even tries too hard to see it. And so I just really appreciate you speaking to sort of the spirit and the worldview has a significant factor. It's not just, by nature of the molecule, so on and so forth.
It's a partnership. It's definitely a partnership, and going for one day and going through ceremony and being respectful and doing whatever the leader is asking you to do, or listening to the music, it can be life-changing. But in terms of percentage-wise of how many people are going to be truly transformed, it's got to have this deeper commitment and practice to really, like Augustine, what kind of commitment and practice was it that he was able to guide this? And I've seen him do healings that were amazing, right? So we've just got to be mindful about that and be careful about the financial and monetary perspectives that are driving a lot of this, and the last resortism that some people are looking at it with.
Can you speak a bit more to well, first I'll make a comment of just wanting to celebrate, acknowledge, and appreciate the people who are dedicating their lives to legitimizing psilocybin for dying people and learning the skills necessary for them to have safe and effective experiences that help resolve and integrate their experience of being in their dying time, who aren't necessarily indigenous, but in some sense, by default, need to learn to embrace a kind of indigenous worldview in order to support people into those experiences. Can you speak a bit more about the last resortism that you just brought up?
Well, thing that came to my mind as you were just talking now was, what right does the medical profession have to be doing any of this? They've been involved in causing so many problems, racism and medical racism and all the things that's the last place, right? They don't even look at nutrition, right? I think Johns Hopkins has an elective in it. I think that's part of this. The answer to it is that we've looked at the medical establishment as our place. I was diagnosed with terminal cancer in 2008, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. I thought that my only resort, to use that word, was the medical profession. So I went to two of the top oncologists, one in Mexico and one in the United States. Both of them said, yeah, we got to take out the 9-centimeter tumor in your abdomen. We've got to get you on chemo. With it, you've got a good chance of surviving 7 to 10 years. So I went into the lodge, prayed on it. Spirits told me what to do. And I did no chemo. I did no surgery. That was, I don't know how many years ago 2008 was, but you can figure that out. So I think we've got to have an understanding that if you are ill or you have a terrible trauma and someone says, it would really be great. Let's just go let's just go out tonight and make a fire under the stars and have some mushrooms. It can help. But if you look at it as this is a last resort, that means that you've automatically eliminated that you are going to change the worldview. And I think that they both go together.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think, the last resort as a part of the, inside of this medical institution is sort of, we'll say like a group of people or a section of people who are, I think, as inspired by the wisdom and the enlightenment, a la what Darcia said earlier, wanting to bring forth this kind of worldview through and into the medical institution, because that's a place by which, if they effectively manage to legitimize the practice of providing people psilocybin, they can help to offer that onto people who otherwise in the medical institution, amongst palliative medicine, a lot of deeply, beautifully selfish, caring people in palliative medicine, but they can't seem to figure out how to help people to the degree to which psilocybin seems to. What what was I going to say there? Oh, but part of how they can legitimize even giving it is being like, oh, it's okay because it's a last resort. Nothing else works. They're going to die anyways. So why don't you give us a chance to try this thing that, according to the medical institution, is wildly uncertain and dangerous and risky and all the rest. And in order to increasingly legitimize, like, actually, it isn't all of these things if it's held in a proper container, and eventually to step back to, what some research are saying, like, okay, yeah, for sick people, depressed people, dying people, but also for the betterment of well people as well, right? Like, let's get to that point too. And so I really appreciate you speaking to the last resortism, and then also bringing in that the last resort is being used as a legitimization track to get it in the door so it can start making its way back into sort of, ideally being something without stigma for people to access hopefully without fear of being taken advantage of, harmed, or etc.
Oh.
So let's go back to grief and relationalism, or relating with others. A guy, his name is Francis Weller. His work was talked about this is so many layers of interconnection, in a YouTube video from this person who makes these videos that I, by default, pretty much cry every time because they're just so beautiful. And this particular video was about the movie The New World, Colin Farrell sort of replaying the Pocahontas story and explicitly using it as an opportunity to look at the differences between grieving practices between the indigenous people and the settler people, and it being effectively the sort of the difference between grieving in community and being left to grieve alone, right? And that Weller's suggestion is something like, grief is always too much for one person to hold, right? Every time it's always too much for one person. It requires a connectiveness. And that connection, those relationships aren't going to be there by default simply because you need it at the time. They emerge as a consequence of everyone putting into that. And I'm wondering about the precept of self-initiated relational healing and how that plays into a lifetime in the kinship worldview that creates the scenario where, in moments of deep grief, dying, death, extreme circumstance, that those relationships, those webs are there to support the individual and the communities.
Well, all I can say is yes.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I was thinking, this is another one of those of course things. And it's interesting because when you're thinking in the ways that Darcia and I have been thinking for so many years, some of these things get to be so obvious that questions that are legitimate for everybody else, it's like we go, yeah. But I think that if you're in a worldview that is a relationship worldview, a kinship worldview, and that is then anything that you do of significance is being not only shared because of community and proximity, it's shared because there is an interdependent phenomenon that is unknowable, that is part of what you're going to continue with. And we don't know how it works exactly. I know there's a guy who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Richard Bach, one time told me, he said, well, I think there is such a thing as reincarnation, but nobody knows how it works. I think it's simultaneous. And he tried to explain that to me, and I still have a hard time with it, right? But whatever it is, I think there's enough wisdom in the indigenous cultures around the world who observe nature to say that what we're doing in this life and in our dying and in our moving on is interconnected with that place and the people and the energies and the mountains and the rivers that are there. And so the relationship is absolutely inseparable, and whether all the way from the death and dying and the work to stop it, to the death and dying and the grieving. I think that relationship doesn't have any boundaries.
And we are connected to the unmanifest, right? The spiritual realm of our ancestors. I feel their presence, the spirits of other probably ancient trees that used to be here, and native peoples who used to be here. The place is full of spirits, if you're aware of it. And to honor them and to feel like you're never alone. It's a place of unbounded connections and possibilities. So even if you're alone physically as a person, you're not alone because the whole world is alive, and
Beautiful.
even the world you can't see is alive. So
sure,
Beautiful.
and then knowing that is one thing. But then, like, knowing it up here, for the people listening, I'm just like pointing my head, and then like actually feeling it to be true in your heart are sometimes very different things. And I think this goes back to, the importance of ceremony as life is sustaining. Because from what I'm understanding, ceremony is a way to like keep that ability to feel that is true in your heart, sort of like regularly exercise. I mean, that's a very reduced, simplified way of putting it, but that's part of cultivating that throughout life, so that in the days that our expression of meanness, dissolves back into life itself, that's on board, right? That's practiced.
Yeah. So ceremony throughout the day, gratitude for the water that you're drinking, the living water full of love. It's there to nourish you, right? To keep you, sustain you. To have gratitude for that, for the food, each animal or plant that's given its life to sustain your body, the air and the sunlight, all free gifts from the natural world, the nature's gift economy that cycles in and out of giving and taking, and just to be constantly reminding yourself of that you're just part of this whole big process of living beings, I think really helps.
But just the idea, I live on the ocean, and just the knowledge, scientific knowledge that I'm breathing in what the ocean plant life gives me, and then plants that are in my garden are benefiting from. I mean, to stop a moment and think that's sort of an ultimate independence, right? Right there, an exchange of relationship.
And to talk to the plants, right, and ask them, I talk to the weeds and I say, I'm trying to get the native plant here to grow better. I'm sorry, I'm going to move you. or the ant that shows up on my desk, you better be careful. I might squish you accidentally. How about if we go over here, to treat them like it's a partnership. It's a relationship. It's not just you alone doing your thing, or you and your family or community. It's all of us together.
And Darcia, what you were just saying speaks to one of the precepts explicitly: centrality of gratitude. And in the last, I think we've got something like 10 minutes here. Maybe we can sort of come to a close with becoming fully human, because this is one of the precepts, right? Maybe like taking everything that we've talked about today, like how would you bring to a close this precept, or bring this conversation to a close through the precept of what it is to become fully human?
I think this is an unusual way to
pause. I think there might be a snake in the tree outside. Sorry.
Oh, Darcia, then you go first, Darcia.
All right. I think it's about connection from the beginning. So every baby should feel connected from beginning to end of life. And all of us are responsible to make that happen, right? So that the mother feels supported when she's pregnant, that the medicalized birth is not so disruptive, that mother and child connect and bond at those early moments when they're ready to kind of mind meld and body meld together right after birth and naturalistic birth onward throughout our lives. We need to feel that deep connection and honor it. And when you distress a child, you are breaking the connection. And we have to understand that, and that leaves scars. So those of us who've experienced loss of disconnection, we have to get back into healing ourselves, to self-calming, to building our social relational capacities and our receptive intelligence and connection. And so I think becoming fully human starts with connection, ends with connection. And it's learning how to be respectful then in those connections. And that's where the indigenous practices are important. So our focus is the indigenous worldview. So that's this big kind of bubble of orientation that we all can adopt. It's not the same as indigenous wisdom, traditional ecological knowledge, which is land-based, place-based, tradition-based, language, unique language embraced. That's the wisdom we need to support in all indigenous tribes that still exist on the planet, to help them maintain that wisdom, because they're the ones maintaining biodiversity. 80% of the biodiversity is on their lands, which is only 20%, according to the United Nations report. And so we can adopt the indigenous worldview, but then we support those with their deep indigenous knowledge at the same time. It will take us a long time to get back to that, which we can try to attempt for our young people, but at least the indigenous worldview is something all of us can do.
And the long time, I think the Misak example shows that people that have already been a little closer to it can do it in a generation. The Misak have lost, almost like many of our tribes, the Navajo, the Lakota, have lost most of the traditional wisdom, and the repercussions are alcoholism, domestic violence, starvation, unemployment, etc., from the continued genocide, abuse of policy. Well, the Misak, who are on a small reserve in Ecuador, they were also suffering from this alcoholism and problematics, loss of the language, culture, and the sheep were not growing, etc. Some women got together and said, we've got to do something about this. We have this opportunity here. We're not being forced into another kind of education system like our brothers and sisters are around the world. Why are we falling into this trap? And to make a long story short, you could go on YouTube and put in decolonizing the mind, Misak, M-I-S-A-K, and you'll see a young person talking about what they did. And essentially, in 1.5 generations, now everyone speaks the language. Alcoholism is almost gone. The sheep grow bigger, the corn grow bigger. And so we're not that far removed. I mean, they were closer to it, right? Obviously. But it's doable. That said, becoming human doesn't mean survival necessarily. I wrote the book on Sitting Bull because I felt he was an example of not having hope that we can turn things around and still becoming human. He was in a throe of smallpox. Buffalo had all been killed. He was being chased. And yet he never stopped singing songs, writing songs, practicing ceremony, helping others, being generous even to the enemy. The things in the interviews about what he did for courage are amazing. And one time some reporter asked him, so things aren't looking that good. Why are you so engaged with life in so many ways, even here in prison? And he says, because I want to keep being and becoming a human being.
Beautiful.
I mean, it's hard. I have a lot of friends. I mean, someone asked me at UBC before the pandemic, you think that with Indigenous Worldview can turn us around and we can save ourselves? And I said, no. I said, I don't think so. It's possible. Anything's possible. But I don't, from a probability perspective, my right brain is saying probably not, or my left brain is saying probably not, because even though I do see more and more people waking up to Indigenous Worldview, look what's happening policy-wise around the governments and states. Although in Mexico here, Colombia just got its first president who is a liberal president in the history of Colombia, and just appointed 3 indigenous cabinet members, right? And so, I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't things happening. I just don't think the chances are we can turn it around. I think we're going to have to use indigenous worldview teachings in your program. I hope people turn into who are going to be doing the rebuilding. But that's just a personal feeling. I like Václav Havel's definition of hope. Hope is not certainty of an outcome. Hope is the certainty that what we're doing is the right thing to do regardless of the outcome. I may have paraphrased him, but I think that connects to your question also.
To become human is to practice becoming human, right? So it's the indigenous worldview precepts will help you become more human.
Well, on that note, this has been a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for your time today, as well as the work that you have put in writing the book and the work you've obviously put in over a lifetime, not over a lifetime, but over the course of your lifetime, to be able to produce such a beautiful book. To close us out, maybe each of you could just say a quick where people can find more of your work. The book, I'll make a comment in the outro where people could buy the book, but specifically if they'd like to follow you individually.
Well, my websites are evolveness.org and kindredmedia.org, and there are 4 arrows, and I have Indigenous Worldview essays and podcasts and interviews there as well.
We also have a new audio book on Audible that people can listen to the speeches, the 28 speeches, and hear Darcia and I in dialogue.
And then 4 arrows, you have 4arrowsbooks.com to find more out about your work.
Or it's just as easy. I tell people just put in 4 arrows in Indigenous Worldview on Google.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So thank you for that. And again, thank you so much for being on the call today and everything that came to be in order for this to come to be. I've really found a lot of personal value, not only in this call, but in the book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview. And I hope, with respect to 4 arrows, how you described hope, I hope that this has the impact that we all hope it does. The work and the podcast.
Thank you so much for your insightful and sincere, heartfelt questions. In fact, I would like to just say in some words in Lakota that maybe the vibrations will know, but it will be about giving thanks, giving a sense of walking on this difficult road as being important. May I do that?
Yes.
Can I just say my last thing and then we can end with that?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you so much, James. It's just a pleasure to be with you. You're an amazing podcaster. It's so thoughtful and so forward-thinking and integrative. Really appreciate it. It's been really a pleasure.
Thank you.
Otumkashira wakantanka namakompo natuteo atopa unshimaka ahitwa yonkela mishante tawo wogala ke na pechuze pelo oyate oyasi unchi wichala pona oichaki po hecho wichazani washte when you are big deal oyate oyasi chankuluto ochnamani ihani lako which hakitumkashira kiksi metako oyasa. All my relations. Thank you again.
Thank you. And cut. Okay. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I hope that you will find it as valuable as I did. Reading their book and also participating, like having the honor of participating in a dialogue with them. I guess is it a trialogue? Anyways, really valuable. And felt very life nourishing. So hopefully you experienced something similar to that. And if you did, and you'd like to follow up with their book, it's available basically everywhere. Ideally, I would encourage you to check out your local bookshop, order it from your local bookshop or from bookshop.org if you're in the United States. And if that's not available to you, of course, Amazon is an option as well. But yeah, do check out their book. I'll make sure there are links in the description to link right over to where you can purchase the book. And you also have the option of following up with their things online, such as the other interviews I've done with Darcia, or directly to her Kindred World or Evolved Nest links, or head over to Four Arrows link, which I can't remember offhand right now, but is in the description. Again, this show is brought to you by people like yourself through the voluntary financial contribution of Patreon and other forms of donations such as PayPal, or supporting me indirectly by buying things off the shop. So if you are enjoying and finding value in the show, please do consider purchasing something from the shop or from one of our affiliates, or directly donating to the show or becoming a patron. That would be super awesome and really, really appreciated. Alternatively, non-financially, you could just become a follower on the newsletter. Again, that's also going to be linked in the description. And that's all for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in all the way to the end. And I will see you on the next one. Take care.